and using evidence, using science to inform best practices for how to coexist with lots of wildlife. So I've worked all over the place on all different kinds of species, and hopefully that shows in some of the talk today. So how do we coexist in a hot, hungry, and crowded world? Some people refer to the era we're living in as the Anthropocene, meaning really dominated by humans. Every landscape has the impact of humans, even in remote places that we think are pristine, really are still impacted. So the common thread, and I think the greatest need across all the different places and species that I've studied, is finding solutions to conserving biodiversity, to protecting the vulnerable from the powerful, whether that's a stakeholder group that's not listened to in our state wildlife management paradigms, or if we're talking about maligned wildlife that is vulnerable to corporate interests or human livelihoods that don't necessarily always make space for some of these wildlife species. So all these challenges and actions fit under the umbrella of coexisting with wild nature. And today I want to talk to you about both the research and the advocacy that helps us begin to answer this question: what does it mean to coexist with wildlife? So I use this picture from my master's work. This is one of the focal individuals that I followed around, a subadult male. He's raided some backyard trash cans and gone up to a roof and is snacking. And so I think this picture indicates some of the challenges in lots of different contexts for coexisting with wildlife, and defining what is coexistence. Is this coexistence in this picture? Do we all agree on what coexistence is? In my work, I've found that there's lots of different ideas about how much overlap we should have with wildlife. So in this case, the macaques overlapped with people quite a bit. They were living in one of the densest urban city-states in the world, and doing pretty well, sometimes too well. Sometimes they were overweight because they had so much human food. But there's disease transmittance between monkeys and people, or at least the potential for it. Their diet consisted of wild fruits, but also human food sources. Conflicts were rare and low-level aggressions, but they did occur and would sometimes make the news. So is this the ideal? Would it be coexistence if monkeys only stayed in the forest and there was little spatial overlap with people? What if the monkeys only left the forest at night when people didn't see them? So there was spatial overlap, but not temporal overlap with people. So depending on how you think about all of these elements and the questions that you're asking, these variations on human-wildlife interactions may or may not constitute what you consider, or what a researcher or another person considers coexistence. So what is coexistence? To explore the definitions and ideal goals of coexistence, we have to examine and kind of break apart all these different elements of spatial overlap, temporal overlap, to really understand what's happening at the nexus of humans and wildlife. And that helps us find solutions to the challenges so that we can say we are truly coexisting. So I've got to back up even more. Before we talk about coexistence, we have to talk about the ways in which we might think about the opposite of coexistence. So often this is talked about conflict. People talk about human-wildlife conflict all the time, and that framing can mean a picture like this. So sometimes this is human-wildlife conflict, a bear raiding a garbage can in Colorado or Nevada. But sometimes when we talk about conflict, we're talking about conflict between human groups, often referred to as the sort of us versus them dynamic. The one picture is taken at the Roundhouse in Santa Fe, where ranchers were objecting to basically Mexican gray wolf recovery and some of the policies related to that. The other picture is a young man from Michigan who was at a Department of Natural Resources meeting. I took this great picture of him, but I think these pictures represent this idea of a different kind of human wildlife conflict, which is really human conflict between people. And I think this is where the crux of the issue is. We have lots of solutions, and later on I'll talk about some of them for dealing with direct human wildlife conflict, like the bear raiding garbage cans. We've got bear-proof garbage cans, and so really what it's about are people's willingness to use those garbage cans, people's willingness to try new things, to put some effort into sharing space with the wildlife that we find near us. So to understand this us versus them dynamic, starting my PhD, I looked at a theory called social identity theory, which helps us understand conflict between all different kinds of human groups. This theory has been applied to multiple different cultures across the globe for all kinds of different cultural conflicts, from religious debates about abortion to smoking bans in bars. So what social identity theory tells us is that all human groups compete for resources, whether it's territory or whose values are dominant in a decision-making structure. And rather than lumping people in silos of prototypical stakeholder groups, identifying these social groups helps us better understand why groups are competing, where the conflict is happening, and what they're fighting over to address the root cause of conflict. So, look at this and you think, okay, we've got a population of different kinds of individuals. Well, really those people, even if they're all living in the same city or state, they really have their own identity groups, whether it's I'm a rancher, or I'm a wildlife advocate, or I'm a birder or an outdoor recreationalist, or I'm a Green Bay Packers football fan. I mean, all these kinds of things can be relevant identities that are actually separating groups. And so what we tend to do is create biases based on whether people are in our group or outside of our group. So people inside of our group, all my friends who are also Green Bay Packers fans, they wear foam cheese on their head and they watch football on Sundays in the fall. And they're great because they're like me. And because I know them more, I see them as individuals. The group is heterogeneous, even though we're united in this one interest. So we tend to have a positive bias towards looking at people who are like us. And then when you have somebody that's the out group, the other, and there's a competition for any sort of resource, we tend to have biases that say, oh, they're all the same and they think this way and it's no good and it's a problem. So this is general human nature. There's no saying this is good or bad. This is just kind of the tribal nature of all people at our root. So social identity kind of helps us group people, as I mentioned, rather than just prototypical stakeholder groups. So another way to think about how people affiliate and how they share values is to think about how they define the moral community. And this is where conservation ethics comes in to help us understand, okay, where are the common ideas, the common values that might find agreement, even if we identify differently. So even if I don't identify as a rancher, I might talk to that rancher and say, well, we both respect the value of life and believe that you can't take a life for no good reason at all. And that's sort of what the moral community is getting at. It's really getting at how we attribute this concept of intrinsic value, which is really just an inherent worth. So if a wolf has intrinsic value, that means it has a right to exist beyond my use of that wolf, whether it's to watch it from afar in Yellowstone or kill it and use its pelt. Those are all sort of utilitarian uses of various sorts. But if I say the wolf has intrinsic value, that means it doesn't matter if I get to see the wolf. It doesn't matter if I get to use the wolf. I believe it has a right to exist. So, and when we survey people, most people agree that yes, intrinsic value is attributed to all life in all species, and perhaps even ecosystems. So this is a bigger idea of whole, healthy, functioning ecosystems, not just the sum of their parts, but the entire healthy system has its own intrinsic value. So that's why we talk about preserving biodiversity and full systems, and start thinking about landscape level conservation. So we can disagree about other values. We can disagree about potentially the nuances of when it's okay to take a life. So for some people, they would say it's okay to take a life for food, and other people would say, at least animal life, no, I'm vegan. I don't think that's right. Most people generally agree that most Americans, I should say, and most New Mexicans agree that hunting for food, for instance, is likely justified and not a strong violation of most people's attributions of intrinsic value, to put it really wonky and academic. But when we start asking these questions, we can really narrow down where is the conflict, where are the sources of agreement, and then we can start talking about wildlife-related policies and what, as a society as a whole, we agree are good reasons to manage wildlife in various ways. And really, most postmodern societies are shifting away from various reasons for killing being justified to really narrowing down what are the reasons that we can really take a life. And that's an ongoing and evolving conversation among ethicists, among society, among constituents in their legislatures, and there might be diversity in this group about that, and that's okay. That's interesting. And maybe we can talk about that at the end too. So those are some of the frameworks: the social identity theory, the understanding of conservation ethics, and how we define our moral communities. And that helps us kind of think about, all right, let's look at different examples and what is coexistence in, on the ground in the real world, not in the academic sphere where we're looking at these different frameworks. So to do that, lots of people have tried to define coexistence. This is one from my colleagues. Camilla Fox is the executive director and founder of Project Coyote. Dave Parsons, you might know that name. He's in Albuquerque now. He's the former Mexican gray wolf recovery coordinator when they were reintroducing gray wolves into the Gila. He was the lead for that for the Fish and Wildlife Service. And then a couple other folks who are on our science advisory board for Project Coyote, who are well known in their field as conservation biologists. And they define coexistence as a mutually beneficial living arrangement that meets vital needs of humans and large carnivores. So I think that's a pretty good one to consider. And then there's another one by my colleagues, Neil Carter and John D.C. Linnell, and they study coexistence in lots of different forms, from tigers in Nepal to bears in Norway and everything in between. And they define coexistence as a dynamic but sustainable state in which humans and wildlife co-adapt to living in shared landscapes. So there's a lot of elements here that are worth considering. There's the fact that it's dynamic, it's changing, it's not just a steady state where everything stays the same. It's co-adaptation. So think of a two-way arrow of interactions between humans reacting to wildlife and wildlife reacting to humans. That's what we mean by co-adaptation. And then, of course, living in shared landscapes. So some folks say that the only way to conserve wildlife is to have them in protected areas over there, and humans live here in our dense cities. But modern ideas and lots of scholars are starting to argue that shared landscapes are essential to conservation, particularly of large terrestrial carnivores, but lots of kinds of wildlife and ecosystems that require a good amount of space. Like all good academics, they're very long-winded, so their definition continues, saying that coexistence is also where human interactions with wildlife are governed by effective institutions that ensure long-term wildlife population persistence, social legitimacy, and tolerable levels of risk. So this is getting to the human side. This is getting to how do we make our decisions, and do people trust the decision makers or the process by which those decisions are made? Are they seen as legitimate? And this, points to a lot of areas where I think in North America we have a lot of work to improve our state wildlife agencies, basically to reform them, to listen to all of their stakeholders. That's a huge issue, one that we could talk more about. In the context of New Mexico, there was some legislation this year that was hoping to start this sort of reform, possibly changing the name of our state wildlife agency and changing some of how it does business so that it can protect not just game species that people want to hunt or consume, but also any and all species in New Mexico. And unfortunately, that didn't get very far. And there's hope that it'll get resurrected in other legislative sessions, but definitely lots of work in New Mexico and beyond on this front. So going back to this concept of coexistence, I mentioned that some people think about conservation and coexistence only occurring in protected areas and a lot of separation between humans and wildlife. But when I surveyed about 700 conservation professionals across the globe in about 20 different countries, we got these results where we asked, can large carnivores and people in this context share space? And 86% agreed. So overwhelming support that it's land sharing, it's spatial overlap between people and wildlife that's key to what we would think of as a coexistence goal, and not this idea of land sparing where large carnivores only exist in protected areas. Some additional results from the same survey, we asked the conservation professionals, what are the different elements of coexistence, taking some of them directly from the definition that we were working with. So human adaptation to carnivores had high mean agreement, and then the size of the bubble indicates how much consensus within that. So the mean agreement is just an average among everybody, but then the size of the bubbles sort of shows the confidence intervals, the kind of margin of error, and the breadth of diversity. So you could have a lot of people saying, indicating 1, like total disagreement, and a lot of people saying, indicating 5, high agreement, but then you get a 3 as an average. So this is telling us a little bit 2 different things. Either way, we see high consensus and high agreement for those first 4 indicators of coexistence. That's human adaptation to carnivores, that's acceptance of some conflict. So acknowledging that we're not going to have zero conflict when we share space with wildlife, we're going to have to deal with some. Enforcement and monitoring the rule of law. So that's are our conservation officers patrolling and making sure that wildlife policies are being followed on the ground. And then the locals' acceptance of management authority. So this is, do ranchers in the Gila accept, wolf-related policies being enforced by the Fish and Wildlife Service and potentially the State Wildlife Agency eventually. We saw less agreement and less consensus for the need for carnivores to adapt to humans, as well as regulated hunting of any carnivores or prohibiting all killing. So those were things that we don't see as much agreement, and those might be sources of conflict, sources of disagreement among conservation professionals, places that we might want to think more about, or places where we say, permitting regulated hunting of carnivores is just really not a policy option that we want to consider, since it's really not, very well agreed upon. We also asked about strategies for reducing conflict, and now we don't see so much difference in consensus, but we do see lots and lots of these different considerations being considered pretty effective. And the first 3, I think, are really key. So avoiding situations that put people at risk, adopting livestock husbandry practices that prevent attacks on livestock, restoration of wild prey. So these 3 things really point to coexistence tools. These 3 things talk about preventing conflict before it happens. And you'll see way down on the list, the thing that's considered the least effective is legal hunting of large carnivores. And yet we see in North America and lots of places, including New Mexico, that legal hunting of large carnivores and other wildlife is still a policy that's offered, and there's still a lot of talk about um, legal hunting having management benefits. And this legislative session just ended, and I was giving testimony in support of Roxy's law to ban trapping, snaring, and poisoning on public lands. And that was one of my main points. I had to put on my scientist hat and say, as a wildlife biologist, legal hunting of fur bearers, as is currently allowed, is not legitimate management. And of course, our opponents wanted to keep offering that it was. So this is a point of contention that I could spend all day talking about, and I have in a lot of contexts. And it gets old because our best available science is showing that there's really no support for using lethal control in the ways that we do, and only very, very targeted situations where you have a repeated problem animal will conservation professionals ever recommend lethal removal. So broad legal hunting doesn't work. The science supports it, and yet we're still fighting these policies in lots of places. So it's another area where we have some room for improvement in terms of coexistence. One more graph, I think, for a while, and then I'll be done. So another question we asked is, is utilitarian uses conservation? And folks really said no. Conservation is reducing negative impacts of humans on carnivores. It's promoting this intrinsic value concept that I was talking about earlier. It's reducing negative impacts of carnivores on people as well, but it's not promoting even what might be considered sustainable use, low-level hunting of carnivores by humans. So I've looked at these questions in the context of several different case studies. Seeing I'm already at 6:30, I've been talking quite a while. So I might go through some of these species really quickly and maybe focus on the relevant Mexican gray wolf case study, since that might be more familiar to folks. So, and that's the first one. So thinking about some of the elements that I highlighted in that coexistence definition. Are we spatially overlapped? Are we sharing land with Mexican gray wolves? And I would say to a limited extent we are, because we do have folks living within the recovery area. We have folks who are grazing their livestock in areas where there are wolves. And so there is spatial overlap, but there's really very low tolerance for wolves and livestock in the same place. I imagine lots of folks are pretty aware. So when you think about this is the kind of the map of in blue, where probably the extent to where Mexican gray wolves were, in that tiny little red spot is where they currently are. So really the spatial overlap is a fraction of what it probably should be. And this is just showing a little bit more detail on the primary and secondary recovery zones for Mexican gray wolves. So this other question about coadaptation, this two-way arrow, are humans adapting to lobos and are lobos adapting to humans? I would say it's variable and it depends on the stakeholder. And some of this coadaptation can be negative. And again, it depends on how you're thinking about what's adaptive exactly and what's not. So lobos sometimes take livestock that might be in one sense adaptive. It helps them feed their pups and have higher success in an area where there's low elk and other native prey. But eventually, because of the retaliation that we see from certain humans, in the long run, that behavior might not be adaptive. So it's really variable. The other question we asked in this case study of Mexican gray wolves was, is there a tolerable level of risk that we could that we have achieved or could be aiming for in the situation of lobos in the Southwest? And I would say because we have a particular stakeholder group who is highly intolerant of wolves for the most part. And again, I'm not talking about all ranchers. There are definitely ranchers who are doing a great job at sharing space, at preventing conflict before it occurs by having range riders by putting up fences with rotational grazing regimes, all kinds of stuff. There's great examples, and there's also the opposite, where there are certain folks who really just do not want to share space with wolves, and they say, you know, my ancestors, my grandfather and grandmother got rid of wolves, and there was a reason for that, and we don't want to share space. So tolerable levels of risk posed by wolves is not acceptable to certain stakeholder groups. So we've got some challenges with Mexican gray wolves and coexistence. So I would say generally, no, we don't have a coexistence framework, but lots of us are working really hard to promote coexistence with lobos. So there's hope in the future. Just briefly, coyotes are a great example too, just because coyotes are everywhere. So yes, we're definitely land sharing. We've seen coyotes have a great response to the presence of humans and spread across North America more than once, but at least in this last expansion, it was in part because of humans, in part because humans got rid of their wolf competitors or predators. But either way, they're now in New York City and Chicago and downtown LA, and basically living anywhere humans are. Coadaptation is another question, and for coyotes, definitely, they've adapted to humans really well. The extent to which we've adapted to them is still a challenge. So folks don't necessarily understand coyote behavior, and if they see one during the day, they assume it's aggressive or rabid or something dangerous. So definitely room for humans to adapt to coyotes, particularly in the realm of being educated about what's normal behavior or typical behavior in how to share space and avoid coyotes getting habituated to human food. You know, that's another big challenge. Tolerable levels of risk, I would say mostly yes. You know, every once in a while, a coyote makes the news for running into a Quiznos or something, or being on the subway. And sometimes that freaks people out. Sometimes people think that's a great, funny story. But for the most part, we don't see these elevated levels of risk and fear around coyotes like we do with other carnivores like wolves in particular. But the big caveat is that our federal government, through the US Department of Agriculture, in a program called Wildlife Services, maybe you've heard of them, maybe you refer to it as wildlife disservices if you know anything about what they do, but they spend taxpayer dollars to kill coyotes. They will aerially gun coyotes, poison them, trap them, shoot them, just about any tool, archaic tool that you can think of in the lethal toolbox. Our federal government uses to wipe out coyotes, particularly during calving and lambing seasons when you've got vulnerable domestic animals on the ground. And they just try and wipe out as many coyotes as they can, and knowing that within 7 to 8 months, their populations are going to rebound and they're going to have more pups at younger ages. So recognizing that it really doesn't work in the long term to even try and control coyote populations, our federal government still wastes all this time and money trying to kill coyotes rather than prevent conflict before it occurs. So tolerable levels of risk mostly, but this huge caveat that wildlife services is sort of ruining the coexistence possibilities for us in most places. I'll just briefly go through grizzly bears. So land sharing is somewhat limited. The green shows you the large extent of their historic range. Basically anywhere that's not desert or really, really dry west of the Mississippi. And now as of 2010, you can see their current extent in the green in that map on the right. So pretty limited in terms of spatial overlap compared to their historical range. Coadaptation, this probably requires more time than I have, but really interesting with bears, it varies by age and sex class. So females and subadult males tend to forage closer to human residences in an attempt to avoid adult males who can be aggressive to both of those age and sex classes. So they might actually be adapting to human residences in a way that's useful for avoiding aggression from adult males. But of course, sometimes this is negative. So any animal, regardless of age or sex, if they're getting too close to human habitation, they get lethally removed in lots of instances, unfortunately. So that's a kind of nuanced story that's happening in terms of coadaptation. Tolerable levels of risk, I would say it's achievable. And this, I outline in the paper that these case studies are presented a number of different reasons why grizzly bears are probably more tolerated than wolves. And it kind of gets to human perceptions and mythology and the big bad wolf and Little Red Riding Hood in a way. And I just see that there's a lot more possibility. We see a lot more openness to coexisting with bears than we do with wolves. And it's, it's somewhat speculative to say why. But at least it's hopeful for grizzly bears for sure. I like to include this. This was one of my key informants, somebody who's a professional bear biologist who studied them for years. I interviewed folks to understand these different case studies and the nuances. And I really like this quote from one of my key informants, my interviewees. "It doesn't take many bad apples to spoil the batch. Some intolerant folks breed conflicts given how widely bears range and how indelible food experiences are." And I think this applies not just to bears, but all kinds of wildlife. If you've got one neighbor feeding coyotes, you've got one person who's ruining the chances for coexistence in the whole neighborhood, right? So coexistence really is a community thing. It takes everybody to be educated and know how best to respond and adapt to sharing space. And so that's the challenge of coexistence in many ways. So coming back to this sort of overall question, what are people doing to implement best practices, best coexistence practices on the ground? How are we doing this in a hot, hungry, crowded world of the Anthropocene? And I've touched on some of this already. We've got range riders that are great. Just the simple presence of humans on these landscapes is enough to keep most carnivores away. Or if you're talking about birds that want to eat a protected crop of cherries, fruit, there's lots of examples. Just the presence of humans to chase them away or just keep them away really does a lot. And this is sort of ancient tool. This is your modern day shepherd on a horse. Sometimes they're on ATVs, but this is really one of the keys to protecting domestic livestock in wild places. It's just this vigilance, really. Another really old tool with modern updates is fences and what they call fladry. So these red flags that you see, it's referred to as fladry. Some people say flaggery or just flags. But this is really effective, at least in short time frames, say a calving or lambing season when you've got a lot of vulnerable animals on the ground that you want to protect from wolves. It's particularly useful to put these flags up, and wolves don't want to walk underneath them. They work to a certain extent with coyotes, but for whatever reason, not as good. And this fladry has a dark past. It was actually adapted in Scandinavia to funnel wolves into an area where they would be hunted by humans. And now we're using the tool for good, which is kind of cool. So whenever I think about coexistence tools, I like to think about, we've got these old ancient tools like fences or shepherds or even guard dogs. And we're adding modern updates to them. So we're using solar powered, electrified wires to our fences or our fladry. We're using GPS collars to know where wild animals are and where they are in relation to our livestock. We're using fox lights that flash and look novel and strange and keep carnivores away. Obviously, there's tons of examples for birds in terms of the various modern scarecrows, like the the inflatable car salesman guy that's in parking lots, right? That's been used to, in some instances, to keep animals away, just because it's strange. Of course, animals are all smart, so they eventually can learn, habituate to a new stimuli when they realize it's not actually harmful. So that's why these tools are context dependent. They require a dynamic change over time sometimes. Sometimes you have to be using multiple different tools, and it really depends on, are you in rough, rugged terrain that's hard to cover? Are you protecting sheep right next to a house and you want a different kind of guard dog that barks or doesn't bark as much? There's lots of questions like this. So lots more work to understand best practices for coexistence and what works in a particular place. And of course, there's policy. So I always include this picture of Richard Nixon signing the Endangered Species Act. We forget, sometimes I think that this historic legislation was actually signed by Nixon. But we have to remember this kind of broader level policy. So there's the bottom up stuff, there's the coexistence tools, and then there's the top down things, and they matter too. And that's the sort of state and federal policies that we engage in. This is another example I always like to include of a unique way of drawing attention to a conservation issue. This is a comic artist called The Oatmeal, who put together these series of slides in his on his website, a blog post on his website, basically. And he generated over 50,000 comments on U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decision about protecting grizzly bears in the North Cascades. And this was a great example of reaching new audiences and unique ways of really promoting coexistence in a way. So I always like to end where I start, thinking about where we are in relation to the rest of the world, and taking this big picture approach and thinking about how to truly promote coexistence. It takes democracy, it takes good governance, it takes lobbying for against legislation, driving public input, and it takes NGOs, non-governmental organizations, to compel the government and their agencies to do their job sometimes, and sometimes that happens through lawsuits. It takes direct action, and it takes diversity and creative thinking, and that's where we're at with coexistence. There's lots of frontiers, and talking about it in talks like tonight is one of the best ways that we can share ideas and move towards a better coexistence future. These are some papers that I referenced as my talk. So with that, I'll wrap it up and open to questions.
Thank you so much, Michelle. That was awesome. Yeah, if any of you have questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask it yourself, or type it into the chat box there. Well, okay, if no one has anything, I'll go ahead. I have a question. So,
Okay.
Michelle, can you kind of elaborate on the current state of, I'm thinking of both our laws in Grant County, which I know you know quite a bit about, and then also the new bill that passed the House of Representatives. What is the status on each of those regarding lethal use of controlling predators?
Okay, yeah. So I think you're referring to the trap ban bill that passed the legislature.
Yes.
So that's passed both houses, the Senate and the House of Representatives, both chambers, I should say, and that's way farther than it's ever gotten in years. So there's this long history, almost a decade, of this bill being introduced every long session, so every other year, and this bill bans traps, so all kinds of traps, leg hold traps, body gripping traps. It bans snares, neck or foothold snares, and it bans all kinds of poisons. And this is on all New Mexico public lands, including state trust land. So that's passed, that's great, but it still needs to be signed by our governor, Michelle Lujan Grisham. So that's a push that we've are now focusing on is really kind of highlighting that there's broad support across the state. So the governor, it makes it really easy for her to sign this, because it's not official until she signs it. So that's one action that's ongoing. But we're really still very proud and excited that it's gotten this far, because it had really never passed more than one subcommittee in one chamber of our government in the past. So this has been incredible, and I think it really shows how far we've come in terms of thinking about coexistence and non-lethal tools. And science is now showing us that non-lethal tools work. Science only answers the questions that we ask. So for a long time, we didn't even ask about, do we really need to be trapping? Or do we need to be lethally removing animals in these different ways? And now we're seeing, oh, we've asked these questions, and it's actually way more effective in terms of preventing attacks, and it's way more cost effective in the long term to be using these non-lethal tools. And we've got great models all over the country for where that's happening, and people are really committing to it. In terms of Grant County in particular, that's been also a really long battle. To the thing that I know about most is reforming wildlife services and their contract with Grant County. So the county contracts, lots of counties across the West will contract with this Department of Ag program called Wildlife Services that I mentioned during my talk about. Basically, they just mow down coyotes all over the place, but they also kill lots of birds with poisons to protect crops, or purportedly to protect crops. So we've really been trying in lots of places, including Grant County, to change those contracts or end them completely. And that was a long time coming in Grant County to make some progress in terms of, first we tried to cancel the contract, and that was so hard that we could only get increased transparency, where they were at least reporting what they were doing when they were taking the county's money to kill wildlife. So it started with just some better reporting requirements, and it's evolved to, I think it's canceled the contract completely. Megan, do you know? There was a back and forth where they were going to cancel the contract, and then kind of backdoor dealings changed that. But I think there were still some reform measures in terms of getting them to use non-lethal first, and not being able to use M44 sodium cyanide bombs. Is that?
I don't. Yeah, I think you're right, but I don't know.
Yeah, there's been a lot of back and forth. And Wild Earth Guardians is an organization that I used to work for when I was really focused on the wildlife services reform, and they continued that work in Grant County and made some success around reforming the contract. But I can't remember if in the past year they've fully canceled the contract. But generally, wildlife services reform is still something that we need to keep an eye on. Was that answering? Go ahead.
Yeah, that does answer. But just so I know, like, how did that come about? Like, why Grant County? Who did someone reach out from Grant County? Because isn't that the first county in all of New Mexico to have something like this?
Yes. So way back in 2016, Wild Earth Guardians used the Freedom of Information Act to get all of the information on county contracts in the West, basically across the American West, all these county contracts with wildlife services. And basically I shuffled through over 10,000 PDF pages of these contracts to look at, okay, who has a contract, which are the worst ones, and where are there counties where we've got commissioners who might be favorable to listen to non-lethal. And Grant County had just gone from 3 to 5 commissioners, and those 2 new commissioners are very progressive, Alicia Brown and Alicia Edwards and Harry Brown. Yeah, so they're great. And when we saw, okay, we've already got 2 people, we just need to swing 1 other commissioner. So we've got 3 out of 5 that would vote to change the contract or abolish it. That's why we focus in Grant County. And there's been some work in Doña Ana County too. And then other places in California, there's been some work done. California has basically there's the Environmental Protection Act at the federal level, and then some states have their own what they call mini or state NEPAs. National Environmental Protection Act is NEPA. So some states have their own really good policies on that front. So we've been able to use that in California to cancel contracts with wildlife services because those policies require environmental analysis, as is required on the federal level. Some states require it, like California. So we've been able to use that as a hook to say, you know, if you did any sort of environmental analysis in this place, you would know that wildlife services is not helping because their practices are so outdated, so cruel, inhumane, and not good for the environment. So unfortunately, New Mexico doesn't have that, but in some places we can use that as a more legal hook that they're required.
Well, that's so exciting that there's much progress. That's a lot of
Yeah.
Ann Beckett, hi Ann, says, has anyone studied or evaluated the cost of hunting to kill predators versus using coexistence tactics like range riders, guard dogs, etc.? So the cost.
Yeah. One really good model is one that was started by my executive director, Camilla Fox, in Marin County, California, where she got wildlife services contract ended, and they created their own model in the county where they shared among everybody who had livestock that wanted help in protecting. They had a cost share program where everybody contributed a little bit to it, and that scaled up so at the county level so that somebody could come in and they could put up fences, they could train guard dogs and train people how to use guard dogs or llamas or donkeys to protect wildlife in these non-lethal ways. And they've studied this over, well, it's been 15 years now, I think, since they started it, but a couple people published some of this work after 6 or 7 years, and they found that they had saved quite a bit of money. And I don't remember the exact statistics, but something like a third of the costs of the wildlife services contract for the lethal control over time, they were spending a third of that annually on this non-lethal program. So we definitely have, that's one great example. We definitely have others. The Blackfoot Challenge in the Blackfoot watershed of Montana is another great example where they're coexisting with grizzly bears and wolves with a similar kind of non-lethal program funded through a cost share pooling of resources. And that's another one that's been really cost effective and really great. So lots of examples like that. Short answer is yes. It's cost effective in the long run.
And Lisa asks what federal agency is in charge of wildlife services?
That's the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So another strange, it wasn't always this way, but at some point, this wildlife services program went from the Department of the Interior, where everything else like public lands and wildlife is managed, over to the Department of Ag. And so that's part of the problem. And that's another area where people have said reform should happen. If you've got people managing wildlife, they should be in the Department of the Interior, where the rest of wildlife management occurs. They obviously have their own biases, pro-ag, anti-wildlife, anti-environmental conservation of any sort, to be rooted in the Department of Ag, arguably at least. So that's one of the issues there. And there's a weird history. Wildlife Services wasn't always called that. It used to be under the U.S. Biological Survey, which became USGS, the Geological Survey. There's a strange history, but basically it's been almost a decade of Wildlife Services enacting this war on wildlife and killing everywhere they work. It's really kind of awful that it's still happening.
Do they show any sign of changing at all, changing their ways, or being? Do they say they're open to it, or is it just?
It's mostly lip service. In some instances, I think they see the writing on the wall. In particular, wildlife service agents who are, so they go in when a Mexican gray wolf potentially takes livestock in the Gila. They're the ones that go in and investigate these things and determine whether the rancher gets compensation. Because if it's taken by an endangered species like a wolf, the rancher can get compensation for that lost cow, calf, whatever it is. So they go in and do these investigations. And what they've been doing is just saying anything and everything is a probable wolf kill. Even if they look under the skin and they look for hemorrhaging. Was the animal alive when they had these bite marks? Because an animal can scavenge afterwards, right? And you have to measure the bite marks to see, is this a coyote? Could this be a dog, or is it a bigger animal like a wolf? And is there this hemorrhaging to suggest that the animal was being bitten while it was alive? I've gone on these investigations. They're pretty gnarly. Finding some old bloated cow out in the landscape and investigating whether it was killed by wolves or carnivores, other carnivores. So they have been under scrutiny for saying every lost cow is a probable wolf kill. And several nonprofit organizations have been putting pressure to increase the transparency of that process and be more rigorous in their investigations. And so when I was out there, I saw them saying, you know, we have to be more careful. We have to document, and we can't call every one of these, you know, a probable wolf kill. And they offered to me that some of their motivation for this was to, you know, help the rancher get more compensation, which would increase his tolerance for wolves if he's getting paid for all these losses. Even if they're not wolves, they're perceived as wolves by the rancher. And I can understand where they're coming from. If that's a genuine motivation, they're trying to help wolf recovery and the rancher, fine. But there's also scientific studies showing that this monetary compensation of livestock losses after the fact does not do anything to increase tolerance for wolves. And what we really see are programs like Pay for Presence, where a rancher has a pack of wolves on his grazing allotment or on his property. He gets paid, he gets compensated for the number of wolves successfully living in that area. Those kind of programs compensate the rancher, increase tolerance, and also incentivize non-lethal rather than lethal. If you wait until after the fact and you've lost your cow, you've got an angry rancher who wants to retaliate and put poison out on that dead carcass and get as many coyotes and wolves as he can. So compensation doesn't work. Pay for presence might. Anyways, your original question was, are they changing? I think in certain circumstances, they're seeing the writing on the wall. They know they're going to keep getting sued. They know they're being watched. So there's some small incremental change in certain places. Like I said, in California, some counties have canceled their contracts. So they're seeing that they're losing business. So there's some hope, but it's really slow going.
Yeah, sounds like it. It's sad.
Yeah.
Anne asked something. She recently saw that Wildlife Services is killing owls. Is this about timber? I haven't heard of this. Anybody?
Yeah, I'm wondering what particular owl species. In the Pacific Northwest, folks are killing barred owls because they've expanded into spotted owl territory and are out competing them. Maybe this is Wildlife Services in some instances. That's the first thing that comes to mind. There might also be accidental take. So Wildlife Services tools are so indiscriminate that they accidentally kill all kinds of species. They kill family dogs. They almost poisoned a kid. Sometimes they accidentally kill endangered species because they're putting traps, snares, poisons out that's going to get anybody and everybody out in the landscape. So it could either be an intentional take that's that hasn't been covered up, because they do that sometimes, or it might be this barred owl issue, which is an interesting case study in terms of conservation ethics and whether is this a justified reason to take one wildlife species that's doing well and kill another species that's not doing well. Again, the root cause are people, right? It's people's changing the habitat. It's people cutting down old growth that these spotted owls can't do as well. Do we really want to scapegoat barred owls because they are doing well, in part because we've changed the habitat? It's a good question, and it's a tough one. But yeah, that might be what that one's about.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
It does become quite a philosophical question. When to stop tinkering?
Right, exactly. And yeah,
alter things, it just kind of snowballs.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one of the other kind of frontiers of coexistence and conservation is thinking about novel ecologies and thinking about species that are either non-native or what you might call invasive. So people are calling barred owls invasive because they're expanding their territory. People call coyotes invasive or non-native because they've expanded their territory. But does that mean we try and keep conserving to a state that was, 100 years ago before Europeans affected this continent? There's a lot of people that are starting to ask questions about maybe we embrace novel ecologies in these new species as they expand, because we need overall biomass, we need overall diversity. So why kill one species when the other one is not doing well and we're not fixing the core problem of habitat fragmentation, destruction, that sort of thing. So it's sacrilege as an ecologist to say, hey, maybe we should allow these non-native species to thrive. But some people are starting to ask those questions and kind of unpack the values and the science around that. Because we might be assuming that certain invasive species have damage just because we have great examples of where they do, but not all invasive species might. This is another area of work that I collaborate with folks in China who are looking at Burmese pythons not doing well in their native range because they're getting pulled out and sold into the pet trade, but they're doing really well in Florida where they have, derbies to kill them in every way. So there's a question about, should we be thinking more globally about conservation? Should we try and protect pythons in their native range by flooding the pet trade market with pythons from Florida rather than killing them? That's just one example of some of the questions that are being asked that are kind of new territory for sure.
Wow. Super complex stuff.
Yeah.
Andy says, do you think humans could be considered an invasive species?
Well, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah.
Nice.
So for my master's, I studied long-tailed macaque monkeys. They're the second widest ranging primate after us. But yeah, absolutely. We've mucked up every system that we're in. And that's all the systems we have on our home planet for sure. So definitely invasive. Definitely needs some population control, maybe.
Sure. All right. Anybody else? Maybe not. Well, this has been really fun.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you all.
No one else. I know. I kind of feel like you could go on and on about the Mexican gray wolf too. That's a whole other program, and I have a bunch of questions about them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Michelle,
Yeah.
I have a comment. In my home state of Ohio, in northern Ohio, there are a lot of deer. And I wouldn't expect you to know about this situation, but I wonder if they could bring in coyote or, well, I don't know if coyote kill deer, but if there's some predator that they could bring in to coexist in that area, that would reduce the deer population, because they are just, since I left Ohio 40 years ago, they have just multiplied, and it doesn't stop because they are in a metropolitan area. So they can't be poisoned, they can't be killed, but they are now a real nuisance, and people don't respect the deer anymore because they eat their landscape, and they are hazards on highways. So I don't know what the solution is. They must be working on it, but it seems to have been a long-term problem that they have not been able to solve.
Absolutely, and that's a great point. I'm originally from northern Indiana and lived in Michigan, so I'm somewhat familiar with white-tailed deer issues in the Midwest, and they are totally overpopulated. And deer vehicle collisions are a huge thing, a huge loss of human life, a huge cost to property damage. And there's lots of folks that are arguing we should promote predators in these places to reduce human vehicle collisions, to reduce chronic wasting disease. We know that wolves, at least in some contexts, are really good at reducing diseases like chronic wasting disease that's spreading across North America. So I would say more predators generally are great. Coyotes are in Ohio. They're expanding their range across North America. So they've been in Ohio for a while. The thing with coyotes is that their mortality impacts on deer. So they will sometimes take adult deer, sick deer. They will take fawns, but we don't see, typically in most contexts, we don't see coyotes impacting deer populations to the level that would really actually, more than in a local area, reduce it. So what some Midwestern cities are doing are having municipal deer hunts, where deer hunters would only use a bow and arrow that would be safe to do so in a, urban park or a park that's near human habitation, basically. So if you use a bow and arrow, that you have to be really close, and there's not going to be accidents as if you were using a shotgun or a rifle. So municipal deer hunts are a thing. I have a friend who likes to tell a story of getting a deer in an urban park in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and having to carry his quarry across downtown Ann Arbor after he processed the deer in the park. So obviously that's not for everybody, and that's going to upset some people. So there are alternatives like fertility control, basically, that's being tested on white-tailed deer populations, where we can't have wolves running through town or urban hunters controlling the population. Some cities have hired sharpshooters. So when I was in Bloomington, Indiana, they did that. They spent a bunch of money, and it was really contentious, in part because some people just didn't want the deer called at all, and other people didn't like the money. But Bloomington was a tough place for white-tailed deer. I do have to tell this one story. I had just moved there, and I was walking my dogs around, and my neighbor was driving his convertible through his backyard and around his house, on the grass, on the lawn. And I just stood there and watched, wondering what he was doing. And he said he was chasing the deer away from his garden, putting rats in his yard.
Gosh.
I guess that's pretty, harassing the deer, but I guess that's non-lethal. I don't know. There's probably better ways. But yeah, some people get very upset. That deer is a pretty contentious issue in the Midwest. So another area for work.
Thank you.
Of course.
And Michelle, to go back to your inflatable car, I love that. What case was that used for?
I think that was used for wolves in Washington. And it worked for a little while, but they figured it out pretty quickly that this is not that scary. It's just weird.
That's hilarious.
Yeah.
My dogs probably would have freaked.
Yeah, my dogs are weird about statues of any sort.
Yeah.
At first.
Well, anything else? Anyone?
I just want to say thank you so much. I need to leave at this point, but I really appreciate your spending your time with us, Michelle.
Well, and likewise, thank you so much. Have a good Friday night.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Michelle.
Of course. Thank you.
Thank you, Megan.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you all for coming. Glad you could join us.
Thanks. Good night. Good night. Cheers.
Bye. Okay.